On an empty stretch of Missouri Road, the most wanted man in America found a little girl sitting alone in the dust beside the body of a horse. No people, no wagon, no help for 30 miles in any direction. She was 7 years old. She had not eaten in 2 days, and she did not know she was talking to an outlaw with a price on his head. She only knew he stopped. And what that hunted man did over the next 4 days, turning off his own escape route, riding slow and exposed in daylight with a child on his saddle, into the exact kind of danger he'd spent his life avoiding, is a story almost no one has ever heard. Missouri, the summer of 1876. Stay with me, because the reason he did it will stay with you. Here is the story. Her name was Nellie, and she was 7 years old. After the fever took her mother in the spring and left just the two of them, her father had loaded a light wagon and set out to carry her to his sister, an aunt in a town 2 days east, the only family they had left in the world. They never made it. Somewhere on the second day, her father's heart simply gave out. He slumped over on the wagon seat between 1 mile and the next and did not wake again. And the team, with no hand on the lines and no voice to guide them, drifted off the road and dragged the wagon into a dry wash and broke it. And in the wreck, one horse went lame and the other tore loose and ran. By the time the stranger came up that road, little Nellie had been alone in that empty country the better part of 2 days. She had not wandered off to look for help, because her father had always told her that if you are lost, you stay put and you wait. So she had stayed. She sat in the thin shade of the dead lame horse, because it was the last thing left in the world that was hers, and she waited for someone to come, because she was 7 and she did not know what else a person was supposed to do. Wherever you're watching from, drop it in the comments. I'd like to know how far this one travels. The stranger came up the road at midday and saw her from a long way off, a small shape in the heat shimmer beside a fallen horse. Every instinct a hunted man owns told him it could be a trap. Men had been baited before with less. He came up slow and careful, one hand near his side, his eyes on the tree line. And then he was close enough to see that it was only a little girl, sunburnt and hollow-cheeked and past crying, sitting in the dirt with her hands in her lap, looking up at him with the flat calm of a child who has used up all her fear and has none left. He got down off his horse, slow, so as not to frighten her. He gave her water from his own canteen, a little at a time so a starving child would not be sick on it, and then the last of the jerked beef and the hard biscuit from his saddlebag, and he sat down in the dust beside her while she ate every crumb of it. And when she had eaten, he asked her, as gently as a hard man knows how to ask anything, where her people were. And Nellie told him, in the plain, flat, unhurried way that small children tell the most terrible things, about her mother who had gone in the spring with the fever, and her father on the wagon seat 2 mornings back, who had slumped over and would not wake up, no matter how she shook him and called him. And then she told him about the aunt in the town to the east, an aunt she had never once met, but whose name she carried like a coin in her pocket, because her father, in his last good days, had made her say it over and over until she could not forget it. Hartley. Her aunt was Mrs. Hartley, in a town called Greencastle, away to the east. It was, the stranger understood, the last thing her father had been able to give her, a name to hold on to, so that she would not be lost in the world. And the stranger sat there in the road with that name, Hartley, Greencastle, East, and did the cold arithmetic that was about to cost him so much. Greencastle was east, and east was the one direction in the world he could not go. East was settled country, towns with telegraph wires that could flash a description down the line faster than a horse could run, depots with his face pinned to the wall, sheriffs and marshals who read every handbill that came through. East was the exact direction his pursuers expected a desperate man to break for, and the last direction a careful one ever would. His own road, his safe road, the one he had been riding when he found her, ran north and west, up into rough, broken, empty country where a hunted man could go to ground and simply cease to exist for a season. Every hard-won instinct he owned said the same thing. Get the child to the next farmhouse, leave a coin for her keep, point these people toward Greencastle, and turn your own horse north before your luck runs out. That was the sensible thing. That was the only thing a man who intended to keep breathing would do. He looked at her sunburnt face and the careful way she had folded her hands, and he could not do it, because the next farmhouse might turn a strange child away, or worse. Because a 7-year-old alone on the roads of that country, in that year, was prey for things this story does not need to name. Because her father had made her memorize a name so she would not be lost, and had died with that name as his last gift to her, and it seemed to the stranger a black sin to hand that trust off to whatever happened to come down the road next. So he made the choice that turned his own escape into a slow, exposed crawl through dangerous country. He set the little girl up on his saddle in front of him, and he turned his horse east, toward Greencastle, toward the towns and the wires and the men who wanted him, and he started the 4-day ride to deliver a child to the only family she had left. They were 4 days that no hunted man in his right mind should ever have spent. He could not ride hard and fast through the empty places the way every nerve in him wanted to, because a 7-year-old cannot ride hard and fast, and because a lone man galloping cross-country with a small girl draws every eye on every road he crosses. So he went slow. He went in daylight, in the open, his face there for anyone who cared to look, past farmsteads and freighters and families on the move, tipping his hat and keeping his voice easy. Once he had to take the edge of a town to find water, and a printed handbill with that very face on it hung in the depot window, not 100 yards from the trough where he watered his horse with Nellie's small hand tucked in his. He did not hurry. Hurrying is what gets a man noticed. He bought her a proper dress and a pair of shoes in that town with his hat pulled low and his words few, and a hot meal she ate like she had never seen food before and might never again. And when the storekeeper asked, he said quietly that she was his daughter. The lie cost him nothing, and it bought the child her dignity, and he rode on east out of that town with his neck hanging out a country mile. At night he made small, careful fires down in low hollows where the light would not carry, and cooked what little he had, and Nellie talked the way a child talks, once the very worst is behind her, and there is a grown-up nearby who seems to know what he is doing. She told him about her mother's singing, and the smell of her father's pipe, and the barn cat they had had to leave behind, and the names she had given the chickens, and the stranger, this man whose name the newspapers printed alongside the word killer, listened to all of it, every small word, and answered her when she asked him things, and once or twice he even made her laugh out loud in the firelight, which he said long afterward was a stranger feeling than being shot at. On the second night she asked him his name. He told her a plain common name that was not his own, and she took it and used it, and she said it like it was a fine and trustworthy thing to be called, and that borrowed name, in that child's mouth, landed on him harder than any true name anyone had spoken to him in years. On the 3rd day the sun and the hard road caught up with her, and she came down with a fever, and the stranger sat up the whole long night with her, dipping a cloth in a cold creek and cooling her small hot face, and he admitted to himself somewhere in the black middle of that night, more frightened than he had ever been with a gun pointed at him. A hunted man learns, out of pure necessity, to fear only for himself. It is a kind of armor he wears, and it keeps him moving, and it keeps him alive. But sitting up in the dark over a sick child who was not even his, With no doctor for 40 miles, and no one to send for, and nothing in the world he could do but wait, and cool her face, and listen to her breathe, the stranger found that old armor simply gone, stripped clean off him, and some part of him was almost grateful for its going, even while the rest of him was sick with fear. Near dawn, the fever finally broke, and her breathing eased. She woke up, asking for food, which he had already learned was her way of telling him the danger had passed, and she asked, small and hopeful, if they could go on to her aunt now, and the stranger found he had to turn his face away into the dark for a moment before he trusted himself to answer her. They came into the country around Greencastle on the 4th day. He did not ride into the town square. He was not a fool, and there would be a depot and a poster and too many idle eyes with nothing better to do than study a strange face. Instead, he found a boy fishing at the edge of town and paid him a coin to run and fetch Mrs. Hartley out to a quiet lane among the last houses, and to say only that someone had brought her brother's girl. And there, in the long gold light of the late afternoon, the stranger waited with Nellie and watched the road. When a careworn woman came hurrying up that lane, searching, and saw the child, there was a sound that came out of her that the stranger never forgot, half a cry and half a sob, and she ran the last of the distance and dropped to her knees right there in the dirt of the lane and gathered the little girl into her arms and would not let go. And the stranger stood well back by his horse, holding the reins, and watched a thing he had no part in and wanted no part in spoiling, a child being handed back to people who loved her. Mrs. Hartley wept and held the girl, and then looked up at the quiet man holding his horse, and started to ask his name, started to say there was no way on earth she could ever repay what he'd done. And the stranger touched his hat brim and said there was nothing to repay, that he'd only been going the same way, which was a lie, and that the girl had been good company, which was not. He told Nellie to mind her aunt and grow up strong, and Nellie, 7 years old, ran back from her aunt's arms and threw hers around the stranger's waist and held on, and he stood there in the road with his hand on the child's hair, this man with a price on his head and blood in his past, and for a moment he could not have spoken if his life had hung on it, which, in a way, it always did. Then he got on his horse, and he turned its head west, and he rode out of the Greencastle country the way he had come, back toward his own road at last, his own rough, safe country, 4 days and 100 hard miles, and one whole staked life off of the escape he should have been making. He had gained nothing by it that a sensible man could name. He had lost 4 days, worn down a horse, spent his money, and ridden his wanted face through the worst country he could have chosen, all for a child he had never met and would never see again. And by every account he ever gave of it afterward, which was almost none, to almost no one, he counted those 4 days the best he had spent in longer than he could remember. Within 6 years the stranger was dead, shot in the back of his own house for the reward on his name by a man who called him a friend. The newspapers ran the robberies and the killings, the long dark legend of him. They did not run a little girl named Nellie, alone beside a dead horse on a summer road, and the wanted man who turned his own escape inside out to carry her 4 days east to the only family she had left. There was no one to run it. Only Nellie knew, and Nellie did not know his real name, only the common, borrowed one he'd given her, and the size of what he'd done. His name was Jesse James. He had done hard things and dark things, and never claimed otherwise. But on a summer road in 1876, the most hunted man in America found a child with nothing left in the world but a memorized name, and instead of pointing her down the road and saving his own neck, he turned his escape into a 4-day crawl through the exact country that wanted him dead, to put her back in the arms of someone who loved her, and asked for nothing, and rode away, and never told a soul. Nellie Hartley lived to be 91 years old. She married and raised 5 children and buried a husband and grew old surrounded by grandchildren in that same eastern Missouri country. And all her long life she told the story of the quiet man who found her beside the dead horse and carried her home, and how she never knew his real name. It was not until she was very old and saw an old photograph in a book her grandson was reading that her hand went to her mouth and she understood at last who the gentle stranger on the road had really been. And her grandson asked her if it frightened her to learn she'd been carried 4 days across the country by the most wanted outlaw in America. And the old woman shook her head and she said, "No, it doesn't frighten me. I was a little girl with no one left in the whole world, and of all the people who could have come up that road, it was him. He was the kindest man I ever met. I don't care what they called him, I know what he was." If this story reached you, do me a favor, pass it on, and subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more of these coming.